Alright, welcome back. This is New Testament Context. We're on chart 2, and this will be video 12. And we're picking up at Matthew 11, 1 through 15. The first thing we see is this the one, speaking of Christ, is this the one expected to come? And this is John the Baptist asking, sending people to Christ, disciples I guess. Yep, so two of his own disciples. So these are disciples of John going to Christ to see if he's the one that was expected to come. And this is one of the most important points that I've been trying to point out all throughout the New Testament. You can see over and over and over again that the house of Judah and house of Israel, we're going to see both, were expecting Christ to come. They knew about the prophecies in Daniel, but they also knew about the prophecies starting in Genesis. I'm going to summation the Genesis at the end of chart 3, and then you're going to wonder how it's possible that you didn't know any of these, pretty much none of these verses in Genesis about Christ. But basically, the three I've focused on was Genesis 15:1, the shield, 49:10 is the scepter, and then 49:24 is the stone, which is the same stumbling stone mentioned in the New Testament multiple times. So yes, if they knew the stumbling stone, then they knew the message of rock, the Christ was the rock, or the rock was Christ, if they teach it that way. And what is your basic verses then? The number one thing would be Numbers 24, 15 to 24. A scepter shall rise out of Israel, and then in verse 19, out of Jacob, fulfills that prophecy from Genesis 49:10, which Jacob was given a prophecy to the 12 tribes. That's the prophecy to Judah, saying that the scepter would come from Judah. So Jacob knew about obviously Christ, and he knew about him from looking at my chart. The rock was Christ. That started back with the stone, Jacob's pillar stone, in Genesis 28. So let's go to Numbers 24:15. And Numbers 24:15, by the way, is quoted I guess I put my thing in the wrong spot here. Alright, well I guess he brings a star from Jacob in verse 17 is the first verse I have here. A scepter shall rise out of Judah. Okay. He brings a star from Jacob, and from Israel wields a staff that breaks the sides of Moab, destroys his sons, and will seize upon Edom and possess that. For Israel forms his host, and Jacob's son comes down and cuts off escape from the fort. Jacob's son, of course, is talking about the scepter, which is Christ. And then Deuteronomy 18:15 is actually what I was trying to get at. That's the most used cross-reference about Christ, because it says, this is Moses speaking, it says, your ever-living God will raise up a prophet like me for you from among your brothers after me. Listen to him. And that's a fulfillment of Genesis 49:10. You all requested one from the ever-living God at Mount Oreb, basically, on the day of public meeting, saying, we cannot continue to hear the voice of the ever-living God, nor longer to see this great fire. So they're standing inside of Mount Sinai. It says, when the ever-living replied to me, what they have said is good. I will raise for them from amongst your brothers, their brothers, one like you, and will put words in his mouth, and he shall report to them all that I command him. And any man who will not listen to my message, which he delivers in my name, I will drive out from my people. So in other words, he's going to the 12 tribes. Those that don't listen to the message of Christ, he will drive out. So that's the gist of it. But then if you, of course, the Jews against Christ were saying that, denying that he was the Christ even after he had healed people and given prophecies. But here's an interesting thing. If you continue on in verse 20, the prophet who shall presume to deliver a message in my name which I have not commanded him to deliver, or who shall speak in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. But perhaps you may say in your heart, how can I distinguish such a message as what the ever-living has not spoken? When the prophet delivered it in the name of the ever-living, although he was not commanded. When the event does not happen, then the ever-living has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it in his presumption, fear him not. So, this was one of the problems with prophets. I forget which one went to the king and gave a prophecy, and then when he left, he stopped him and told him, well, the king had, repented, and so go back and tell him he won't die. All this won't happen in his lifetime. And the prophet said, hey, wait, I can't do that. Well, the reason he was protesting not being able to change the prophecy is right here, because that gives you the people a reason to kill you when you give a prophecy, and then all of a sudden you that prophecy doesn't come true. If the prophecy comes true, then they are afraid to touch you because they know that you're from God. But if the prophecy doesn't come true, then they're able to kill you. That's a law. So that's what they were saying about Christ. His prophecies were not true, when in fact they were. They just weren't aware of it. All right, Isaiah 2. Now, in Isaiah 2, this is a prophecy of the end time. In fact, most of Isaiah is about the second coming of Christ. It says the event that Isaiah foresaw over Judah and Jerusalem, which he's actually talking about the house of Judah and the house of Israel. The days come when the hill of the Lord's house shall stand at the head of the hills. He's talking about New Jerusalem. And New Jerusalem will be the head of the government on earth run by Christ. And rise over the mountains, and to it all nations shall gather. The mountains, in other words, from Revelation, which I told you were just figures of speech for governments, they were referred to as mountains. So it's a figure of speech. Great peoples collecting shall say, come, let us go up to the house of the Lord. This is end time, so this is New Jerusalem, where Jacob's God dwells, speaking of Christ, and learn of his ways, and let us all walk in his footpaths. And that's kind of a cross to Zechariah 14:16. For from Zion will go out the law, and from Jerusalem, or New Jerusalem in other words, Jehovah's orders, so the orders of Christ, as judge between nations, commanding great peoples their swords into plowshares. In other words, their implements of war, they'll turn into things to raise food with. Their spears into tools, in other words. Nor nation raise sword upon nation, and never learn war. So, again, we don't have a period of time. In fact, our whole country, the whole economy of our country right now runs off of the war and all this perpetual war. It's all based on that. All the money's being made basically on war. And eventually that judgment on the United States and the commonwealth of Christian people, because Christian people have just given up basically doing what they're supposed to be doing as far as the Bible says, electing godly leaders. They're not doing it, so what they've got now is perpetual war. And eventually he's just going to come and put a stop to that, and that's what this is indicating. And I wrote on there, justice and judgment will be established in the house of God. Of course, the house of God, the 12 tribes, will be ruling with Christ in the end time from New Jerusalem. Okay, the government of God will rule over all nations with an iron rod, as it repeats in Revelation, through Christ and the 12 kindred tribes, ending all wars and forcing all to follow God's law forever. So that'll be the end of people violating His law. And if they do, it won't be that they can't. It's just that they'll recognize Christ, and they'll recognize the blessings of following His law. And if they do, they'll have justice and judgment immediately, a short period of time. Which is one of the things that ties to Luke 19:27. A lot of people mention that as if that was meant at that point in time when it was said, as to those enemies of mine who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and execute them in my presence. Well, that's what happens. And basically right at the end of Revelation chapter 19, all these people who they participate in war, they start wars, they participate in banking, like I said, the four things in Revelation 9:20. Fornication, murders, it's murder by war, sorcery, which is the drug industry basically, and then fornication, which means multiple things. So all these people who just make all their money from that don't want Christ to reign over them. At the end, the 12 tribes will basically execute all these people with the help of Christ. So Christ comes with these members of the 12 tribes riding on white horses. However that comes about, you'll see it, and that's what that verse is talking about. So Isaiah chapter 35. Okay, it's mine listed as a song foretelling of Zion's redemption. And then in verse 4, God Himself comes as a Savior to you. So speaking of Christ multiple times. Now the eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf be opened, and the crippled shall leap like a stag, and the tongue of the silenced shall shout. So that's kind of part of that prophecy about the house of Judah. In other words, the Jews against Christ. Their ears were deaf, they couldn't see, and that was part of the parable that Christ gave us in the New Testament. But He's saying at the end He'll do away with all that. Everybody's going to recognize Christ. They're all going to follow His law and so forth. And again, I said they were in captivity, the 12 tribes. And He mentions down here in 8 about the road of the right, and the vile should not use it, but He Himself, Christ, leading His people, and the wicked not transverse that way. No lion be there, so on and so forth. But the Lord's redeemed, returning. So they were in captivity. He's going to come with a strong arm, it said, whatever that looks like, and redeem His people and bring them back. And there's multiple mentions of that, about drying up the 6 rivers and so forth. Returning to Zion with cheers, with delight everlasting forever, in other words, and joy on their heads. Grief and anguish will fly as with joy they return. So they were returning to Zion. So they were from Zion. So again, what I said, these were Christian people taken into captivity, now they're returning. That's exactly what Isaiah says over and over, and the other prophets say this exact same thing over and over and over again. Alright, that's 35, 53. Let's skip Isaiah 53. 53 is about the suffering Messiah, and there's more quotes to the New Testament than we could get into. Quotes and cross references about Christ, basically on the cross. But one of the things he mentions here is that he was destroyed by the crime of my race. That's verse 8, which goes up to Acts 8:33. So he's indicating that his own people killed him, in other words, and of course he's speaking to the house of Judah, or to the tribe of Judah, it could be either one. Even though he had done no crime. Next verse. However, it also gets into this prophecy of Caiaphas in John 11:49. But yet he will see his race spreading with time. So the Christ, speaking about Christ and his race coming back together in the end time, which is what we just went over. And that's where that idea of that prophecy of the high priest, he was saying this is the prophecy. Again, in Revelation, I mentioned all those prophecies, and I've got, I guess, the main one here at the end. So let's go to Malachi. I just say chapter, it was 3:1 actually, I think is what it was, the quote was. This was actually a quote in this section in Matthew. Behold, I send my messenger to make a path before me, speaking of John the Baptist. The Lord that you seek unexpectedly will enter into his temple, speaking of Christ. That herald will come of the treaty you love, but who can endure his entry? Who stand when he searches? Like a fire he is to refiners, and like the soap to a fuller. He sits down to fuse and refine throughout the dross from the silver, and Levi's sons he will cleanse and refine like silver to gold. In other words, he's creating a standard others will be judged by if you just read all through it. And then he's, verse 4 is speaking to house of Judah, house of Israel. Okay. Verse 7, you left my decrees nor regarded my laws from the times of your fathers. And again, he's going back to the time of Moses, so he's absolutely talking about the 12 tribes. Going down, and there's some other good things here, but let's go down to basically chapter 4. For be assured, the day comes that will burn like an oven, when all the cruel and all who practice vice will be stubble and will be burnt in that coming day. Yes, burning the tares. Nor root nor branch shall be left, and that's just talking about the family tree, figure of speech. But the Son of Righteousness, that's Christ, will shine forth to you with restoration on his wings. So he's speaking of redemption, in other words. And you shall be brought out and sport like a bullock from the stall and tread down the wicked. So here, right there, exactly what I just said. It will be the 12 tribes with Christ at the head, but it will be the 12 tribes who will tread down the wicked. Because he just says, that's his 12 tribes. He's bringing out from captivity who will tread down the wicked, for they will be dust under your feet. It doesn't say his feet, it says your feet. So he's talking about the 12 tribes redeemed on the day when I perform it. So this will be a day which was Revelation 19. Everybody knows it. Then remember the laws of my servant Moses, which I communicated to him in Horeb, and the institutions and decrees for all Israel. So, this is the very end. He returns. He brings back the 12 tribes from captivity. They tread down the wicked with the help of Christ. And then he's telling you to follow his law. Remember the laws. You have to follow his law. I don't know what could be more easy to understand. Christ redeemed his chosen from captivity. In the end time, returned them to Zion. No reason to look at Daniel 9:24-27, except that this was a prophecy about the birth and the death of Christ, both of which were fulfilled. And that's what goes to Isaiah 53. But the point of that is who was expecting the birth of Christ except these people that knew this prophecy, and Daniel, and all the ones before it, some of which we just pointed out. And I'll do a complete list. There's really no way to do a complete list, but at least I'll do Genesis and some of the other ones. But this is pretty good here. You've also got Isaiah chapter 11 and so on and so forth. Some of these we've already covered. But who would be expecting their Redeemer to be born and then to die to fulfill a prophecy to redeem them. There's only one group of people ever existed on the face of the earth and ever will exist who would have believed that prophecy, who were expecting that prophecy. No one else was expecting it. No one would even believe that they would have a Redeemer who would come and then die for them, fulfilling his own prophecies. In other words, Christ gave these prophecies about his birth, his death, who was going to kill him, how he was going to be killed, and then what he was going to do in the end time. All these prophecies will be fulfilled, and only one group of people have ever believed all that or were expecting it. So in Malachi, Christ will create the standard. All those will be judged by in the end time. They'll follow God's law. I will enable you to tread on the wicked, in other words, the tares. Now, I just went through some of John here, and then I went through the main ones, 425, 614, and 740 in John, which are the main ones that are cross-referenced. I think one of those is actually a quote. But I said, well, you know, it makes more sense just to cover all the ones. So let's just start. It might be a little hard to see there unless you're on a good screen. Let's just start with the first one, John 1, 18, 21, 45, and 49. Interesting thing. Again, they're coming out to talk to John the Baptist, which were, I think it actually says there were Levites or something that were sent out. Priests and Levites came out to talk to John. And the first thing says, right before that in verse 18, no one has ever yet seen God. He has been made known by the only Son, which is Malachi 4:5, who exists in union with the Father. So, how would they know that there was a Son expected who exists in union with the Father unless they had read these old prophecies and were familiar with them? What I say, 1, 18 and 21. In 21, they're speaking to John. It says, who are you? Without attempting to deny it, he stated, I am not the Messiah. So apparently they knew about the Messiah. What then? They asked. Are you Elijah? He replied, I am not. Then are you the prophet? So, here, right here, the priests and the Levites that were sent to him knew about the prophet. And in 3, my cross-reference on this is Isaiah 43. And I guess I should have done that one while I was over there. So the prophet, let's just go back to Isaiah 40 real quick. Verse 3 is also in Isaiah again, which they're talking about, so they're familiar with it. And this is actually prophecy about John the Baptist and Christ, both in the same. And it starts out 40. Actually, chapter 40 is where it basically starts. Well, it doesn't necessarily start here, but most from here to the end in Isaiah is end time prophecy. Starts out verse 1. Comfort, O comfort my people. Again, the 12 tribes. Your God has commanded. Speak to Jerusalem's heart and to her proclaim that her warfare is finished. Her sin has been pardoned, and twice more than her loss she will have from the Lord. So, this is the end time speaking to the 12 tribes. That her warfare is over, no more war, which is we read over and over. Twice more than her loss she will have from the Lord. Yes, because that's a prophecy to the remnant. A voice cries in the desert, prepare the Lord's path. That goes to John the Baptist in Matthew 3:3, which is where we're at. And straighten the for passage, the road for our God. Raise the valleys, cut down each mountain and hill. So the hills and mountains. Here again, could be a figure of speech about governments. Make the crooked path straight and the rough places smooth. The Lord's glory unveiled, speaking of Christ. Let all see it at once as the Lord's mouth has said. In other words, he's quoting a prophecy that everyone will see Christ, the whole world will see Christ at the same time, at once. And again, 1 Peter quotes us next verse 7 and 8 down here about our God's promise forever remains, and that promise he's speaking about is Christ. Of course, the promise is the first coming and the second coming, which they didn't really know that until later. Still, it's all talking about redemption for his people, and it just continues on. And we're going to end up coming back here to Isaiah 41 in a minute. Alright, that was 18:21, and then let's look at 45. Philip sought out Nathanael and said to him, "The one to whom Moses referred in the law, and of whom the prophets also wrote, we have found in Jesus, the son of Joseph, who came from Nazareth." Yes, so there's a prophecy of him coming from Nazareth, and they knew the prophecies, starting with the prophecies of Moses, which most quote the Deuteronomy 18:15, but also the prophets, whom the prophets also wrote. So they knew that there were prophets, and they knew most of them actually mentioned Psalms. So even though it says Moses and the prophets, it's Moses, the prophets, and Psalms. Most of them knew about what David had said about Christ. So it's Moses, the prophets, and Psalms right there. And they're saying, here he is. They recognize it. Here is an Israelite indeed. When Jesus seeing Nathanael coming to him, so he's telling him, here's one of my people. And then Nathanael answered to Christ, "You are the Son of God, you are King of Israel." So he just is meeting him and realizes that here's the person who was prophesied. Well, some things had happened. And actually right above it says, "We have found the Messiah" in verse 41. I should have included that. But this is John basically talking about here's Christ, the Son of God, so forth, the Messiah that was expected. So the Messiah is generally mentioned in Daniel. Then the next one would be 546, I guess. So let's just go to 546. And here's Christ speaking to the Jews against Christ. In other words, telling them that they don't even desire the redemption which would come from himself. In other words, from God. "For if you had believed Moses, you would have believed me, for he wrote about me." So Moses, here's Christ saying that Moses wrote about me. Well, yeah, he was the one that gave, it said Moses esteemed Christ, so Moses knew who Christ was. They just called him, like I said, other terms. They didn't necessarily call him Christ. So that's 546. Let's see, 614 would be the next one. This was just after Christ had fed the 5,000 with the 5 barley loaves and the 2 fish. It says, "Then when the people saw the evidence which he had produced, they exclaimed, 'This must certainly be the prophet who was to come into the world.'" So here are all the people that had just sat down and about 5,000 people. Some of them, at least, recognized that here was this prophet that they were expecting to come, that Moses wrote about, and the prophets wrote about, and the one in Psalms that they had heard about all this time. So they were all expecting the prophet. They just debated on whether this was the prophet because of he had to fulfill these prophecies about coming from Bethlehem and from Egypt and so forth. And we've already gone through all that. So they weren't aware that he had fulfilled those prophecies. So that's 6:14. So let's look at 7:27 and 40. So here's some of your Jews against Christ. And people stand around. Is not this, starting in 25, is not this the man who they wish to murder? Yet here he is speaking in public, and they say nothing to him. Perhaps, however, the authorities have come to recognize the fact that this man is the Messiah. In other words, the rulers, which were the Jews against Christ, have recognized that he is the Messiah, speaking of in Daniel and others. And they say, we know where this fellow comes from, but when the Messiah comes, no one will know from where he comes. Well, that's not true. They had prophecy saying where he would come from. So they might not have been aware that he fulfilled those prophecies, but it's not true that no one will know where he comes from. Alright, so that's, and then 740. And, you know, here's basically Christ speaking to people. And, an interesting thing. Well, it starts out in 32. The Pharisees, chief priests, they wanted to arrest him. Jesus says he's, for a little while he's with them, and then they'll search for him and not be able to find him because they're unable to come. Then the Jews remarking to one another, of course he's speaking at that time, the Jews against Christ, they won't be able to come, they won't be allowed into New Jerusalem. Where will this fellow go that we cannot find him? Surely he will not go to the dispersion among the Greeks. So right there he's telling you that there's members of the 12 tribes dispersed among the Greeks in those nations. It's one place where there is. And then in verse 40, it says, many among the crowd, hearing this declaration, began to say, this is certainly the prophet. Others remarked, this is the Messiah. But then they say, does the Messiah come out of Galilee? Has not the scripture said that the Messiah shall come from the race of David and from Bethlehem, the village where David was? So, there you go. They knew right there the prophecy that the Christ was come from the race of David and from Bethlehem. Well, I'm not sure how they would say that he wasn't from David necessarily, but they're saying, okay, but he had to come from Bethlehem, and they're not aware that he was in Bethlehem. They're not aware, of course, the other from Egypt, they're not aware that he was in Egypt, so they're basically not aware of his past. And instead of just asking if those things were possible, and about his past, they say, well, you know this guy, he's always lived here among us, so he can't be the Messiah. Okay? But they knew the prophecy. So they were also expecting this Messiah. They knew about it. Next one would be, let's see, we've done everything. 9:17 would be next, I guess. And here's where he's opened the eyes of the blind man. What, and the Jews against Christ are debating with him. What do you say, seeing that he opened your eyes? And the man replies that he is a prophet. And they say, well, they don't realize that, they don't believe that he was blind, even though supposedly he was born blind. And then down below in 22, it just basically says they dreaded the Jews against Christ, for already they had decided that should anyone acknowledge Jesus, basically, as the Messiah, he'd be expelled from the synagogue. So they didn't want to debate that. They didn't want to be expelled from the synagogue for believing the Word of God. Excuse me, let me get the water here. So it was 9:17, go to 11:27. Yeah, and this is an interesting one. This was about Martha and Christ telling that Lazarus would be raised again. He says, I am the resurrection and life. Whoever believes on me, although he may die, he will live. In other words, everlasting life. And everyone living and believing in me shall not die forever. Do you believe this? Yes, Master, was her reply. I have believed that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming to the world. So, here you go. She believed, Martha believed this prophecy, and she had seen and heard the things that Christ had already done, and she believed. And even though there were Pharisees around who saw him raised from the dead, for some reason they still could not believe that he's the Messiah, even though he did these things. 12:34. Alright, so this is after he's been raised from the dead. All are going out after him. And the crowd, basically, therefore remarking to him, we have heard out of the law that the Messiah continues forever. So how can it be it is necessary for the Son of Man to be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man? And so then basically right below in 37 it says, although he produced so many evidences before them, the Jews, against Christ, in other words, yet they did not believe in him, so that the word of Isaiah the prophet might be verified. So there's the one of the prophecies, at least, going back to Isaiah 6:10. There's another one in 29 about that he had already prophesied over in Isaiah that these some of his people were going to kill him. They weren't going to believe on him, and even though they had eyes and ears, they wouldn't listen. So at any rate, that brings us, let's just, so that's, got a few quotes on this next one here. So let's just end that one right there. We've covered everything we need to say about that. The point is, there's a lot more than that, which we'll cover, that will show all throughout the New Testament that all these people were members of the 12 tribes, house of Judah or house of Israel, and they were all expecting Christ. So there's no idea that after all this, after going out, expecting Christ to come for all his years, he tells them to go out to their brethren, the house of Israel, the lost sheep, then they don't do it. And not only that, some other people, unknown white Anglo-Saxons, pick up the message and start teaching it the next 2,000 years and doing everything that the house of Judah and house of Israel was expected to do. And then all of a sudden, all that died out. Those people, we don't know where they are, and yet we have all these Christian people who are doing what they're supposed to be doing. So, you know, this is just another Jewish fable. The idea that all this died out. It wasn't the 12 tribes that continued teaching about Christ, continued following his law, even if it was only a remnant. So let's end there. We'll come back with video 13 on 11:16 to 24. So thanks for watching.